Good morning, everyone. I'm Bonnie Brown, a new member, if we haven't met yet. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this morning, Professor William Smaldone. He's a professor of history right here at Willamette University since 1991, and has won numerous awards for his scholarship and teaching. His research and scholarship focus on a very interesting topic, which is European modern history, early modern history, especially socialism and fascism. So what caught my attention when he was presenting at the Marion County Democrats is the lessons that we might learn from why the German Republic fell to Hitler's fascism. And hopefully there's some lessons for our own times as we're facing some threats to American democracy. And I think you're going to have a presentation, but also hopefully a very healthy discussion after the break. So write down your questions. All right, please welcome Professor William Smaldone.
So is this a good distance from the mic? Okay. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back here with ICL. I know that this is a group that generally likes to have a lot of questions, which is great. So my plan today is to talk for roughly 30 or 40 minutes, and then open it up for questions, and then after the break, we can have an extended period for discussion. So I hope that meets with everybody's desires. So I'm a historian of modern Germany, and I have spent decades teaching about the history of fascism in that country, as well as about the resistance movements that opposed it. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, was the most radical of Europe's fascist parties and was responsible for carrying out genocidal policies against Europe's Jews, Slavs, Roma and Sinti, the mentally and physically handicapped, and homosexuals, among others. The Nazi example was so extreme that I was very skeptical of using the term fascism to describe the views and actions of most American right-wing movements after 1945, even when particular right-wing positions, such as those regarding immigrants, racial segregation, or the role of women in society, were clearly in line with those of classical European fascism during the interwar years. While there were a few groups, such as Norman Lincoln Rockwell's American Nazi Party, that openly espoused a full-blown fascist program. I don't know if you remember Norman Lincoln Rockwell back in the 1960s, but he used to run around in the United States in a full-blown Nazi uniform. He had a very small group supporting him. So they espoused the full-blown fascist program, but they were tiny and seemed to stand at the margins of American political life. Should I not lean? Is that
Just not there. Thanks.
Okay, yeah. So for these reasons, I was very leery of labeling right-wing political movements as fascist, even when many espoused views that I abhorred. The events of the last 10 years have forced me to rethink my position. Along with other historians, such as Robert Paxton, whose book, The Anatomy of Fascism, has long set the standard in the field, I now believe that over the last 40 years, in which both the Republican and Democratic parties have pursued neoliberal policies that have alienated many Americans from their government and from one another, the U.S. political and social system has given birth to a powerful fascist movement. What exactly do I mean by fascism? Well, let's turn to Paxton for a brief definition. Fascism, Paxton argues, is a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, with humiliation or victimhood. To compensate, it promotes cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. Such a movement, led by Donald Trump, has now come to power in the United States. They're not at the door any longer. They've come in through the gates, right, and now occupy all the levers of power in the federal government. The Trump movement, like its fascist forebears in interwar Germany and in Italy, is a mass movement led by a charismatic leader who has created a powerful personality cult and now seeks total power. The movement's ideology draws on a wide variety of radical and often contradictory currents long present on the American far right. It's very homegrown. These currents include white Christian ethnic nationalism, a profound disdain for democracy, often camouflaged by hyperbolic anti-communist and anti-socialist rhetoric, militarism, dreams of imperialist expansion, and an intense fear of foreigners, especially non-white immigrants and people whose lifestyles are perceived to be somehow outside the mainstream, such as trans people. Trumpism has also once again brought America's deep-seated anti-Semitism to the surface, which, as in Nazi Germany, functions as a kind of glue to hold his disparate coalition together. The Trump movement, like its classical fascist predecessors, and like some contemporary authoritarian regimes, such as Putin's Russia, has used a combination of tools to win power. These include paramilitary forces, such as the Oath Keepers, to intimidate opponents. But most importantly, it has used constitutional electoral means. Neither in 2016 nor in 2024 did Trump win an absolute majority of eligible voters. But he and the Republican Party did gain enough support to control both houses of Congress and the presidency. Thus, the Trump movement now has control over much of the state apparatus, and it aims to hold on to it permanently. To that end, it is using methods pioneered by its classic Italian and German antecedents, along with its contemporary counterparts in Hungary, Russia, Turkey, and elsewhere. Neither Italian fascism nor the German Nazis were able to secure full power in one blow. Mussolini was first appointed prime minister in 1922, and it took him 4 years to completely suppress his opponents, to tame the media, seize control of the military, and close down parliament. Hitler learned from Mussolini and was able to move much faster. He had also learned from the mistakes that German Democrats had made when creating the Weimar Republic in 1919. They had failed to remove monarchists and other anti-republican forces from the state bureaucracy, the courts, the police, and the army. Hitler did not make the same mistake. In February 1933, within weeks of his appointment as chancellor, he declared a national emergency and used state power to attack his enemies. After deputizing tens of thousands of his party's paramilitary stormtroopers as police, the regime arrested, killed, or drove into exile thousands of communists, socialists, and Democrats. The Nazis muzzled the press, declared open season on the Jews, and embarked on an effort to bring all state and non-state institutions in line with their policies. In March of 1933, the cowed parliament voted to grant Hitler absolute power for 4 years. In April, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service purged Jews, socialists, and Democrats from the bureaucracy, the universities, and the courts. By July, the Nazis had banned all other political organizations. Hitler's dictatorship was firmly in the saddle. The United States in 2026 is a very different place than interwar Germany. We are not recovering from a defeat in a world war, nor are we in the midst of a depression. And American political history is much different from Europe's. For these reasons, fascism in this country bears its own American stamp. There are no SA or SS men marching around in jackboots, but we are seeing similar political patterns unfold. Like Hitler, who failed to seize power by force in 1923, Trump tried to stay in power by launching a violent coup in 2021, and also failed. Like Hitler, Trump was then protected by the courts and able to mount a campaign for power that united a long-divided American right. He made sweeping promises to restore the economy, to rebuild American power abroad, to drive out so-called invaders who he said were, quote, poisoning the blood, unquote, of the American people, to restore the traditional racial and gender hierarchy in the country, and to wreak vengeance on any perceived enemies, especially those who had attempted to thwart him. We all remember when he said publicly over and over, "I am your retribution." He unleashed the big lie via the internet and mass media in ways that would have made Hitler proud. By ordering the Republican Party to paralyze governance in Washington, and by spreading chaos wherever possible, he worked to undermine the state's legitimacy while claiming that only he could save it. Since January of 2025, Trump has tried to assert the primacy of presidential power over the legislative and judicial branches, and he has demanded unchecked power within it. He has purged most federal institutions, especially the Department of Justice, of all potential opponents, and he has installed unqualified loyalists and sycophants to head all government departments. Just think of this morning the firing of the labor secretary, okay? Another highly qualified type. He has fired inspectors general, whose job it was to oversee the government departments established by Congress. He has abolished whole agencies, such as the U.S. Agency for International Development, without congressional approval, and radically reduced the size and mission of others, such as the Department of Education. He has unilaterally stripped 1 million federal workers of the right to be represented by unions, the most massive attack on organized labor in a century. Like his fascist predecessors, Trump aims to bring as many different institutions as possible into line with his ideological and political policies. So, for example, he has attacked the universities by threatening to cut off federal aid if they do not conform to government decrees regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion, for their supposed support for anti-Semitism and for a variety of other matters. Several major private universities, such as Columbia and Cornell, and public universities in Texas, Florida, and elsewhere, have capitulated. They have paid enormous fines to the government and agreed to submit to federal oversight of university programs. If I were teaching at certain branches of the University of Texas, or if I were in Tennessee and several other southern states, Florida in particular, I would probably have been fired long ago. Because if you treat certain issues, such as racism, as structural problems, and you can't teach German history unless you do that, then you can be fired. And people have been fired. They've been removed summarily from their posts. Similarly, Trump has tried to intimidate the press and social media by using the courts to limit criticism. Many media outlets, such as the Washington Post, the CBS News, and Facebook, have capitulated, and their owners have paid huge fines, altered the content of their platforms, or agreed to make large contributions to the president's inaugural celebrations or plans to renovate the White House. Indeed, just as German capitalists seeking favors rallied around Hitler's government in 1933, America's billionaire class, the vanguard of American capital, has prostrated itself before Trump, from whom they also hope to curry favor, and whose anti-union policies and tax reductions for the rich have filled their coffers to overflowing. And you all remember the pictures of Zuckerberg and Bezos and Musk at the inaugural in the front row. Okay, it spoke volumes, right, for where American big capital stands. These policies are just the tip of the iceberg. It is very important to realize that fascist movements fear the routine banality of day-to-day governance. They thrive on the appearance of dynamism, of continuous, irrepressible success, and of growing strength at the expense of myriad enemies. This requires constant action at home and abroad. And after taking office, Trump acted quickly. He purged the military high command of any perceived opponents, including the highest-ranking African-American and female officers in the service. And he put sycophants, such as Pete Hegseth, in charge of the so-called Department of War. In foreign affairs, he has claimed to be the Prince of Peace. Right. While mobilizing the military repeatedly to attack targets around the world. These include states like Nigeria, where he claimed to be defending Christians against anti-Christian persecution, Yemen, and, spectacularly, Venezuela. After weeks of repeatedly violating international law by bombing and murdering over 100 people allegedly transporting drugs to the United States in small boats, the attack on Venezuela and the kidnapping of the Venezuelan president and his wife was a clear violation of the UN Charter and was carried out mainly with the goal of seizing the country's oil and mineral reserves. And let me remind you, it is the United States, right, that played a decisive role in setting up the UN Charter. Okay, so as we talk about the dismantling, right, of the post-1945 US-built world order, okay, we see it in full flower right there. By reviving the Monroe Doctrine, the American government has told Latin America that it must accept US domination. And to drive the point home, Trump has openly threatened Colombia, Mexico, Cuba, and Nicaragua with similar military action. Trump has sought to radically reduce American support for Ukraine's defensive war against Russia, while cozying up to Vladimir Putin and promoting his dreams of territorial aggrandizement. Simultaneously, his hostile attitude toward Canada, which he dreams of annexing, and his demands for the annexation of Greenland, remember that? Okay, represent a direct threat to Denmark and to the NATO alliance. Following the principle of might makes right, Trump's foreign policy views the threat of force as a legitimate tool, even when dealing with allies on the world stage. The recent unleashing of all-out war on Iran, carried out with the Israelis, was undertaken without consulting Congress or our allies in NATO and in the Gulf region. According to the Prime Minister of Oman, whose government was mediating between the United States and Iran, negotiations seemed to be going well when, suddenly, the United States launched its assault, which, according to Trump himself, mimicked Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. A glorious moment, wasn't it? Right? Trump has given no coherent reason for starting the war, first saying it was to bring about regime change, then to deny Iran of its missile launching capability, then to force Iran to halt the operations of its proxies in the region, and finally, to deny Iran access to uranium stockpiles that he claimed were obliterated in last year's 12-day war against that country. It is an illegal war, different from George Bush's criminal attack on Iraq, only in that Bush tried to make a case for it by lying to the American public and creating a coalition with our allies. The war has killed thousands, caused great local devastation, and struck a blow at the world economy. Trump's assumption that he could simply decapitate the Iranian leadership and topple the theocratic regime has proven to be a grave miscalculation. He is now casting about for a way out that will allow him to claim victory and turn to easier targets. Cuba is clearly in his sights, and Trump, who has publicly said he can do whatever he wants with the island, has imposed a criminal blockade that is causing intense suffering there. At home, Trump has falsely claimed that emergency conditions require sending military forces to keep order in cities controlled by Democrats, such as Chicago, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and, as we all know, Portland. Trump's campaign to round up illegal immigrants has allowed him to build up ICE, the agency charged with immigration and customs enforcement, as his own giant paramilitary force. So you might remember a few minutes ago I said that the United States was different than Germany in the sense that the Nazi Party, before Hitler came to power, built up large-scale, uniformed paramilitary formations, such as the famous or infamous stormtroopers, who were used by the party to stoke terror in the streets. Trump also had paramilitaries siding with him, such as the Oath Keepers, but they were never on the scale, right, that the Nazis had when they were fighting for power. But once in power, Trump has been able to create that force, right? And he has been able to attach it, to fund it, right, to the state, right? He funds it through the state. While cutting government spending for medical care and food stamps, he has allocated $75 billion to expand the size and scope of ICE and the Border Patrol. This rapidly growing force will be by far the largest of all federal police agencies, with $50,000 bonuses and 6 weeks of training instead of 13, as was prior to case. It is recruiting tens of thousands of so-called agents whose activities are not hidden from the public. Instead of arresting and trying in a court of law violent criminals illegally living in the United States, ICE is rounding up hundreds of thousands of undocumented immigrants and others who have committed no crime, and it is frightening, humiliating, and even incarcerating in a metastasizing system of concentration camps, Latinos and other people of color, such as Somalis, whether they are citizens or not. And maybe this issue of establishing camps is something we can talk about later in the question period. Cruelty and intimidation, not law enforcement, is the actual policy. And new ICE officers apparently revel in a culture of violence against those perceived as enemies of the people. We have all seen hundreds of ICE agents running amok in Minnesota, attacking people in the streets, breaking into their houses without warrants, and most recently, shooting and killing 2 of them. Mass roundups and mass incarceration are paralyzing communities around the country, with masked men in unmarked vehicles carrying out military-style raids becoming commonplace. Recently, ICE redeployed the bulk of its forces from Minnesota to other locations. It has adopted lower-key tactics, and the face of Homeland Security, you know who, Kristi Noem, was fired. But make no mistake, the government is attempting to normalize cruelty as policy and to discard due process for those it chooses to target. That will not change under the new secretary, Mark Wayne Mullen. So I'd like to mention here a phenomenon identified by Ernst Fraenkel. Ernst Fraenkel was a German intellectual living in Germany in the interwar period, a Jew who got out in time before the Jews were all rounded up and exterminated in Germany. And when he got out, he came to the United States and wrote a book called The Dual State. And by that term, he meant the normative state and the arbitrary prerogative state. Okay? For most people in Germany in the 1930s, just as in the United States right now, life went on in the normative state. Okay? This is the state that we are used to, okay? It is the state, right, that collects taxes, right, that expects certain behavior from its citizens and protects citizens accordingly. So when your house gets burgled or you get mugged, okay, you rely on the state to protect your interests, to protect your property, to protect your person, right? We all expect what most of us consider to be a state of law, right, to exist in this country, right? And that's what most Germans also expected when the Nazis took power in 1933, right? They were going to maintain law and order. So there was the normative state which carried on, right, for most people, until it didn't. Okay, and the other side of the normative state is the prerogative state. This is where the state can exercise arbitrary power, against which individual citizens have virtually no recourse. Okay, this is the state that picks up people off the street arbitrarily, without warrants, that imprisons them arbitrarily, without warrants, that puts people in pseudo-official prisons, okay, like ICE detention camps, or the model, Guantanamo. Okay? In other words, in a dual state, you have all of the old institutions that continue to function going forward, courts, prisons, all that stuff. Okay? But then you have, parallel to it, a set of institutions, right, over which there is no oversight, and into which you can disappear, never to be seen again. Okay? Or maybe you will be seen again. But it's up to the state. That's the state's prerogative. Okay? And so I would argue that this is a system, this dual state, right, is something that is in the process of formation in the United States. We are living through the experience in our everyday lives. We all get up in the morning and make coffee. Well, I drink coffee anyway. Okay. A lot of us get up and drink coffee. We go about our daily routines, go to the bank. I come and teach my classes. You come to ICL. I see you all. Right? And what else are we supposed to do, right? At the same time, though, all of us know that a lot has changed in this country in the past 18 months, right? And some of us have become active, right, in reacting to that. But it's hard to be active all the time, right? You still have to make a living, and you have to deal with your kids, and you have to deal with all of the things of life, right? And that's what the prerogative state wants you to do. Okay? So Ernst Fraenkel was onto this in 1941, and he wrote an extensive study about it, and I recommend it to you. It's a simple enough idea, though, that we can all mull over, okay, this phenomenon. And we can talk further about this, too, in the question period. So the Trump regime is attempting to justify these actions by redefining what it means to be an American. Trump wishes to eliminate birthright citizenship. And he threatens to strip naturalized citizens of their citizenship if they exercise their right to free speech and protest. I have colleagues who will not appear at public events because they are not native-born Americans, but are naturalized citizens, and they will no longer speak in public. Supported by Vice President Vance and presidential advisor Stephen Miller, Trump's government is promoting the idea of Americanness on the basis of ethnicity, rather than adherence to the principles of the Constitution. Just as the Nazis claimed German citizenship rested on belonging to the superior German race, Vance claims that it is those who can trace their bloodline back to the Civil War or to the American Revolution who are the real Americans. I don't know what his wife says about that. And just as the Nazis claimed that bloodline should determine who can be included or excluded from the national community, Vance claims that certain people, especially people of color, should be denied membership in the American community. Those who count generations of their families dead in the local cemetery are more deserving than more recent arrivals. This is blood and soil nationalism. This is Nazism, pure and simple. It is amazing to witness the speed with which Congress has surrendered its power. Using executive orders as government decrees, Trump is usurping its authority with virtually no opposition from members of his own party. The craven desire for the trappings of power among Republican House and Senate members and their fear of being unseated by Trump in the next primary election has transformed the party into nothing more than a cheerleading squad for the dictatorship. They have accepted almost all of Trump's cabinet nominees, no matter how unqualified. They have allowed the executive branch to usurp their control over money allocated by Congress, over tariff policy, and in the name of drug interdiction, they are allowing U.S. naval forces to murder hundreds of people on the high seas without due process and to attack foreign countries. The congressional oversight has been virtually absent as the Trump family enriches itself by using its position to extract money from a variety of sources, such as foreign powers or crypto billionaires looking to use the presidency for their own profit. And finally, as Viktor Orban did in Hungary, and that's another thing we can discuss because, as we might have heard, right, he was recently defeated. But as Viktor Orban did in Hungary, several Republican state parties have agreed to gerrymander congressional electoral districts so that they cannot lose, no matter how unpopular they are. Of course, now we know that Democrats are trying to match them, okay? We have two wrongs here, right, in my view. At the same time, what else can one do? Another thing for conversation. Protected by a supine Republican majority in Congress and immunity granted to him by the Supreme Court, Trump aims to sweep away all checks on presidential power, to put his own decisions above the law, and to move forward with his domestic and foreign policy goals. The damage is only just starting to reveal itself. This also speaks, by the way, to that issue of living in a state of law, okay, what the Germans call the Rechtsstaat, right? When one lives in a state of law, a classic liberal state, like that established by the United States in the 18th century and then emulated, right, by the French, right, in 1789 and by much of the world later on. In such a state, all citizens are equal before the law, okay? That is no longer the case in the United States. We now have a figure at the head of the government who can commit crimes as long as they are carried out as part of the duties of his office, okay? This means that rather than a republic, we are, in a sense, in transition to a kind of empire, right? Similar to the Roman Empire, when Caesar's nephew, Octavian, was elevated, to the post of princeps, right? In which he was a citizen above all citizens, right? That marked the turn from the Roman Republic, right, to the Roman Empire. We have put ourselves on this road. Right? Our Supreme Court put us on this road. Our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roberts, who liked when he was, I remember when he was questioned before he was named, he talked about, a judge basically being there to call balls and strikes, right? How benign, right? And yet it is Roberts who said, unless we grant him this immunity, he cannot exercise his authority in the robust way, right, that presidents need to, right? Well, we see what that might mean now, because there are no checks on his authority. The American Republic is not dead, but it is on life support. Those who support the Constitution cannot depend on the courts to save it. These, too, especially given the corruption of the Supreme Court, have been weakened. Instead, the future of the Republic depends on the ability of its defenders to mobilize not only for elections, but to defend our institutions, such as the universities and the press, to help those under attack, like the poor, like immigrants, people of color, and trans people. The United States is a very different place than Weimar Germany. Unlike the latter, it is a vast federation of 50 states. And the states have the ability to challenge fascist efforts to destroy the democratic order. The states control substantial financial power. They control the electoral system, which is why Trump is trying to get it. They control the electoral system, the public education system, and myriad other institutions from which they can draw resources and expertise. At least half the states remain in the hands of democratic governments, and although the National Republican Party has been transformed into a vehicle for Trump's fascist politics, not all the states controlled by Republican governments are fully under MAGA's sway. Although nothing is guaranteed, it is still possible that the coming congressional elections of 2026 can be carried out legitimately. For all those who hope to preserve the constitutional order, these elections will be decisive. To broaden support and build momentum for the elections, popular mobilization in the streets is an essential component of successful resistance. Huge demonstrations like those recently organized across the country by Indivisible and other groups function to bring people together, give people hope, and to show the Trump regime that resistance is growing. At the same time, politics at the local level is extremely important. At this moment, winning power at City Hall could be decisive for the future of the community. It matters whether your city councilors will formulate policies that build an inclusive community in which people take care of one another, or whether they promote policies of exclusion and elect to hunt down those they think don't belong. It matters who is in charge of the local police department when ICE comes to town. That's why getting engaged in local politics is so important. It is a place, right, where we can all act, and it is the local government, right, that has the most daily direct impact on all of us. The people of Minneapolis and St. Paul have shown us the way. Even under virtual occupation, they mobilized every day to warn people about ICE, to witness ICE actions, to help their neighbors who were afraid to leave their homes to go to work, to shop, or to go to school. Many people of diverse political views and from a variety of communities know what is right and are working together to defend their communities and demonstrate what can be done. By itself, mutual aid won't be enough to defeat the Trump agenda, but as part of a nationwide movement, it can succeed. Working locally to build community and nationally to defeat the MAGA movement electorally is the best chance we have to secure the Republic and create the basis for a better future. I will conclude with a story about a German politician, Rudolf Hilferding, who some of you might have heard me talk about in the past. His experience was emblematic of the German tragedy of 1933. Hilferding represented everything the Nazis hated: a Jew, a Marxist economist, a leader of the German Social Democratic Party, and a major figure in parliament. Hilferding had reveled in the freedom, equality, and opportunity that the German Revolution of 1918 had brought to his country. He was also very aware of the Nazi threat. In 1930, in the wake of the Nazis' first great electoral victory, he wrote that should the Nazis enter the government, they would use the state's resources to expand their power. They would penetrate the government's administrative apparatus, the army, and the police. Once such a government is formed, he predicted, it would be very difficult to remove. And together with their reactionary allies, the Nazis would destroy the Republic. 3 years later, that is exactly what happened. With the coming of the Depression, the Nazis were able to use democratic elections to win mass support, take over the government, destroy the democratic system, and hunt down their enemies, like Hilferding. Initially, he managed to escape into exile, where he tried to make sense of what had gone wrong. The causes of the Republic's fall were, of course, complex. Ultimately, he believed that the decisive thing was that the German people had been willing to sacrifice their liberty for Hitler's promises of economic security to make Germany great again. Hilferding was eventually hunted down by the Gestapo and died in a Paris dungeon. The German resistance against Nazism was crushed, and, as we all know, only defeat in the Second World War brought the Nazi regime down. It is my hope that almost 100 years after the German catastrophe, we will avoid a similar fate and be able to meet the fascist threat and defeat it. Unlike Germany, which did not have a long democratic tradition to build upon, the American Republic, for all of its many flaws, has had a 250-year history in which, as a result of great struggles, the people have broadened and deepened their democratic rights. That history has left a strong imprint, and it is that history that gives me hope. Thank you. Okay, so I guess we have time for a few questions before your break, right? Yes. Okay. So I see some hands. Right here. Right here, yes.
My name is Ken. That was probably the most powerful and on-the-point speech of where we are that I've ever heard. Thank you.
Thanks.
My question is, how deep does this problem run? In other words, if Trump were to be removed, how much do we have to fear from the Republican Party and our right-wing citizens?
Boy, that's a tough one. So, we have to think about this carefully. If Trump is removed in the normal way, let's be hopeful and think that that the opposition wins the elections in the fall, and then 2 years down the road, his successor, whoever that might be, is defeated. Now, a lot can happen in those 2 years, right? And he will be furious. He will be like a wounded animal, right? If he loses the legislative elections, he will be more dangerous than he is now in some ways, because he'll continue to try to use that executive authority. Right? But say it all goes well, right? And his successor is defeated. Then we have a party in the Congress that has done nothing but support him, right? That is unmasked, right, as an undemocratic institution. And in a two-party state, if one of the parties is openly anti-democratic, you have a very sick system, right? I mean, this is the big problem. Another additional part of that is the damage being done to the institutions of the federal government has to be made good, right? That process will also be very, very fraught, okay? People will have to be removed and replaced, right? How the Republicans behave in the Congress could be decisive in that process. And that raises another issue. When Trump came to power, he purged the institutions, right, of the professionals and of people he perceived to be his opponents, even people who were not his opponents, but he perceived them to be. When the opposition comes to power, does the opposition want to do the same thing? Okay, do we just remove everybody that Trump put in? There's something unjust about that also, right? At the same time, I just talked to you about the lessons, right, that Hitler had learned when the Democrats in the Weimar Republic failed to purge the old monarchists, right, from the government. They left them in the courts, they left them in the officer corps, they left them in power. And then when the Nazis reared their heads, those people allied themselves to the Nazis. Okay, so this is the problem. We have effectively a Republican Party which claims the loyalty of about 30 to 35% of the electorate right now. I mean, Trump seems to have this base of about 35% that doesn't move. It doesn't matter what he says. Right? It really doesn't. So how we manage to comport ourselves during a transition back to some kind of normalcy will be an unbelievable challenge. I have no ready answer for that. Yeah. Yes?
My name is Ann.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, my name is Ann, and basically I've had like 10 questions that you answered in advance. My underlying concern applies to what we can do locally. What we're describing is there are people in our community, for whatever reason, voted for someone they perceived was charismatic. And your word charismatic, I think, doesn't really apply to Trump. I mean, he's medically compromised, he's corrupt, he's old, right? So my question to you is, what is it in human psychology that causes people to have such ferocious loyalty to a character that is absolutely not charismatic?
Right. Well, I think many people would perceive him as charismatic, sad to say. I think people are linked to him because he expresses their frustrations. I think he expresses the views of an element in American society that is deeply rooted, has been there for a really long time, right? And he says what they think but have long been afraid to say. You know? I remember when I was a much younger man, I went to visit my parents. And my parents, I'm from Brooklyn originally, and my parents sort of followed the route of millions of other New Yorkers in the 1960s when they decided that they wanted to have a yard, you know. And so we moved from Brooklyn to the next county outside of New York City, right, Nassau County. And that's where my parents raised their family. And then when my parents retired, they moved to another county further out. It was like all the retired people got up in the 1980s and moved another county out. Okay, and they sold the house that they had, had been our family home. They did very well because of the inflation of the 1980s, and they were able to buy an attached house in an adult 55 and up community, And so when I went to visit them, I was walking down the street one day, and this guy, an Italian guy from Brooklyn, right, I bump into him, and we start to talk. And I said, so, what do you think? How do you like it here? And he says, oh, I love it here. No spicks and niggers. Right? Now, I had been, living in the academic world for a while by that time, and no one had spoken to me like that since the schoolyard, I was just floored by it. And yet, when you think about who supports Donald Trump, I think those are the people, right? And they might not put it that way, they might be more polite, but they see themselves as being left behind by groups that were formerly subordinate and are now, or have achieved in the course of the last 75 years, a certain civic equality that didn't exist before, right? That, combined with the pressure on working people over the past 50 to 60 years to keep their heads above water, and you all know what I'm talking about. The country has bifurcated economically. The opportunities that our generation had that we took as a matter of course. I went to a very high-quality public university system in New York that cost my father virtually nothing. Okay, that is gone, right? And the students we have now who go to public school, the students who go to the University of Oregon often pay way more than the students who go to Willamette. Okay, and so we've got a country now that is economically much different than it was 50 years ago, and where a lot of those sentiments that man expressed to me in the street have not gone away, but are generally just not used in polite company. And Trump says it. And that's all he needs to do. Yeah.
Thank you. Two words came to mind with your last answer, politically incorrect and disenfranchised. Mm-hmm. And so in many respects today, the opposite side is now politically incorrect and disenfranchised. So yeah. There might be a groundswell. But my question goes back to your understanding of history. Mm-hmm. So many of these fascists throughout history have not been able to maintain continuity, persistence, and have not been able to achieve succession. I think about just a few successful examples in history, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. The Romans were able to do it through successive corrupt leadership, yeah. And the North Koreans were able to do it by elevating the leader to a deity. So are those two possible futures for our country?
God, I hope not. I know that Donald Trump has sons. I fear that. I mean, think about all the dynasties in American history, the Kennedy dynasty and so on, right? And a part of it, history, I spend a lot of my time in my own work. I like to write biographies. And the reason why I really like it is because you get to think about human agency, the agency of individuals, operating within historical constraints. So we all operate in class societies, for example, okay? We all operate in societies shaped by conceptions of race, all of these structures, right, that into which we are born and over which we have very little control. And yet, I don't want to deny that human beings have agency, right? And so I think that the individual matters. And this speaks to your question. Because Trump, first of all, Trump doesn't think he'll ever die. Okay? Oh, I mean, this is actually something to pay attention to, because Bezos and these people, they're working on this. They're trying to keep their brains alive, you know. I mean, they've got so much money, right, that this is like a going concern for them. They think that somehow their brains can make it into the next generation, even when they're all old and decrepit already. Right? But Trump, and this speaks to his motives, he hates the Kennedys, right? He hates, even though he appointed RFK, right? That gives him power, right? He hates the Kennedys. He hates these other dynasties, right? Especially the closer you get to Manhattan, the more he hates them, right? Because the Manhattan blue bloods never admitted the Trumps. You know, I remember my mother. You know, my mother knew Trump. My grandfather was in construction in New York. He was small potatoes. But if you were involved in construction in Queens, you knew who Trump was. You know, and my mother would, you know, when Trump was just making it into the tabloids, my mother would say, "Oh, Trump," you know, with this utter disdain, right? And most Manhattan elitists felt that way. So he was never admitted. He has never gotten over that, right? So producing a dynasty of his own, elevating, I don't know, Don or one of the other ones, right, to replace him, to my mind, it's within the realm of possibility, right? And that would be purely based on his own personal pique, right? It's a hard thing to analyze historically, right? Because it comes from his internal fury about being denied access. See what I'm saying? Right? So I'm hoping that none of that happens, right? I would say you're right that authoritarian regimes have a hard time replicating themselves. But the Roman Empire, remember, did last in the West for 1,000 years and in the East for 2. So even though they had problems sometimes moving from one emperor to the next, they were stable enough, okay? They were able to replicate themselves. We have certain periods in Roman history, the period of the so-called 5 good emperors, who many of us are probably familiar with. I mean, when we read about the Pax Romana in school, right, this is the period we're talking about. When you had over 100 years of imperial succession through the adoption of sons, that all sort of worked out until the wrong son got adopted and things went down the tubes, right? But the transfer of power in authoritarian regimes is notoriously fraught, because you have an arbitrary state. You don't have a government anymore that is functioning in the normal systematic way. So, for example, what I would say is Hitler had what you might regard as a court. Okay. All of the institutions of the German state continued to exist after he came to power. When he was dictator, he named a cabinet, probably a dozen people. The cabinet met twice. Okay. The people who were in the cabinet posts carried on with their duties. The person in charge of labor dealt with labor matters. The person in charge of finance dealt with the treasury, all of that. But the real power, okay, was exercised by a coterie of people who had access to Hitler, right? Just like a royal court, right? And Hitler spent his time playing one off against the other, you know, making sure that nobody got too much power, right? He would set up parallel institutions so they would compete with one another, and ultimately, when you had a big issue, he would make the final decision, right? We are replicating that. We are replicating that. So we have cabinet posts. I don't know how many of you can stand it, but every once in a while, Trump broadcasts these cabinet meetings that go on for 3 and 4 hours. And they literally kiss his boots during these meetings. It's one of the most horrific things I've ever seen in American politics, right? Those people they're decorations as far as Trump is concerned. He plays them off against one another, and then he hangs around, right, with people like Laura Loomer, right, and some of these other people who no one has ever heard of, who don't have any real posts, or if they have posts, they're kind of like Steve Miller had in the first administration, right, where he's an advisor to the president, nobody sees him every day, and yet he has decisive influence. He has ear. That's a royal court. Right. So when you have a royal court, then succession is up in the air. Yeah. So I have no ready answer for you either. And historians aren't very good at the future.
There's lots of questions, but I think we better take a break. And so hold your questions. John, you ready to go?
Yeah, no, I was going to say the same thing. It's break time.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you so much.
Sure. Yeah. We'll come back.
Okay. Go, ready to go. Here we go.
I'm Helmut.
Hi.
Thanks so much for bringing up so many pregnant ideas. But you know, I think since World War II, oh, can you hear me now?
Yes,
okay,
yes.
yeah. I suspect since World War II, there's been so much power come to the federal government, and the executive branch in particular. I don't care whether it's Republicans or Democrats. Everyone is obsessed. We are power junkies. Why does everyone want to believe that the United States should be an empire? That's not what the Founding Fathers wanted. And whether you call it fascism or Stalinism or the Italian brand or the Nazism, it's just totalitarianism. It's how we have to then think according to a group of people who really want to run the show globally. Mm-hmm. That's totalitarianism for me. Mm-hmm. And that's the most dangerous thing. So I don't see the Republicans or the Democrats as being that much different from each other. I really don't. When you look at all of our presidents, they've all been slaves to the same system since World War II. Executive power, calling the shots for everybody else in the world. That's unbelievable. Our founding fathers, I'm convinced, would never have accepted this. Uh-huh. So anyway, your thoughts on that?
3 hours later, here we are. All right, so first of all, about the Founding Fathers. So the Founding Fathers established a republic, it's true, okay, but not all republics are simply places where one elects one's representatives and exists in a state, a constitutional order, right, grounded in law. They can also be imperial systems. So one of the reasons why we went to war with the British is because the king had forbidden settlement west of the Appalachians. Okay, so in other words, the king had forbidden the colonists from conquering territory west of the Appalachians. And then as soon as the victory was won in 1783, George Washington, great man that he was able to continue with his land speculation west of the Appalachians, okay? And well, we all know what happened to the people, right, who were already living there, all right? West of the Appalachians, all the way to the Pacific, the American Republic, great advance as it was over what had come before, basically slaughtered them, right? It carried out what one might call a genocide, a genocidal policy of conquest on a continent-wide scale. Nasty business. Right? Meanwhile, while that was all occurring, the American Republic also experienced over the course of, decades, centuries really, an expansion of democratic rights for the people who came here. Just think about some of the sort of milestones along the way. The American Civil War, right, was a war that, well, if you start at the beginning, the American ruling class consisted of white property owning males. Okay, then it was white males above a certain age who could engage in politics. Then it was expanded, right, to include black citizens after the Civil War. So we had to fight a civil war to settle that issue, which of course was not really settled, okay? Then women were gradually emancipated, okay, or granted citizenship rights, right? The history of the country goes on two tracks in a sense. It is an imperial history, as I just described, and it is simultaneously a country that saw the expanded civil and democratic rights for an ever larger group of the population. My point is that republicanism, constitutionalism, isn't necessarily divorced from empire building. Okay? And after 1945, when the British world order was exhausted, it was replaced by the American world order. Okay, and the only part of the world that was not incorporated into the American world order were the Soviet parts of it. Okay, this brings me to your other point about totalitarianism. Okay, it is true that the Stalinist regime and the Hitler regime, so the communist regime and the fascist regimes, they have much in common. Right? Charismatic leader, secret police, okay, arbitrary state. Okay. However, they are different. Right? They rest on different elites. They operate different economic systems. Right? They have to be, in my view, differentiated. Right? So the totalitarianism label has some utility, right? But you have to be really careful in using it, right? Because it's important to understand who is doing what to whom. Right? So, for example, you can't understand the current situation in the United States without understanding American capitalism, right? Which is very different, right, than the problems that existed, say, in the Soviet system, right? Your comments were rather long. I've tried to adjust the elements of them that I can remember. But as I get older, that gets harder and harder.
Hi, my name is Nili. Hi, Bill.
Hi.
I think we've met before.
Yes.
My question kind of carries over from the comment you just made about American capitalism. How much of a role has income inequality played in what we're seeing right now on the right, in the right wing? Mm-hmm. Germany at the time was in a depression. We are not in a depression, but we are in deep inequality, mm-hmm. And rising inflation. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how is that different? And are we looking at the consequences of what's going on right now with the war, right. And how that has affected Asian countries, devastated Asia, mm-hmm. and how it may devastate us, again, from a capitalist perspective?
Okay, so let me speak to the issue of capitalism first. So, in 1945, when the fascist states had been defeated, the victors had to consider what to do next. And one of the things that was recognized across the board, right, by, let's say, the center-left and the center-right, across Europe, even in the United States, was that if you allow the capitalist market to function unleashed, okay, the result can be 1929, okay, collapse, enormous polarization, and the political response is radicalization, okay. So what did you have in Germany in 1933? You had a shrinking political middle, shrinking moderate parties, okay? Even the disappearance, right, of left of center parties like the Socialist Party. It didn't disappear, but it shrank. Who grew? The Nazi parties on the far right, Nazi Party on the far right, and the Communist Party on the far left. Both anti-parliamentary institutions, Okay, they had a majority in the parliament. Once those two groups, who were loggerheads, had a majority in the German parliament couldn't function any longer. So for 3 years prior to Hitler's appointment, you had a paralyzed parliament. Okay, and you had what we would call a presidential regime. Okay, you had the president of the republic and the prime minister could effectively rule together using emergency laws. Right? That was the last 3 years of the Weimar Republic, and then Hitler comes to power, and we get what we got. So after 1945, it was clear that that had to be prevented. The result was the welfare state. Right? The result was the democratization of wide swaths of our societies that had before blocked opportunities. So if, for example, you look at the limitations, or the limited opportunities, that's better, that people had before 1945 to go to the university. Okay, well, after 1945, in the United States, think of the GI Bill, okay, the universities were opened up to the masses, really. Okay, the same thing happened in Europe. Right? Indeed, the Europeans, in terms of constructing the welfare state, were in the vanguard, right? And they built, over the course of the next 30 to 35 years, a very dense web of social security for people, right, that prevented people from falling into the abyss. And this promoted greater equality. Of course, the Scandinavian countries led the way there, but this was also true in Northern Europe in general, right, and even in some of the Southern European countries. Those are the famous 30 glorious years, right? And in those years, the dominant political factions in European politics were the center-left, Social Democrats, they used to call themselves Socialists, right? And on the right, you had the Christian Democrats, right? Those were basically the two largest political formations, right? Who both supported the basics of this system. The United States also built a welfare state. Lyndon Johnson's second most important program, besides the Vietnam War, right, was the promotion of the Great Society, right, which was aimed to combat poverty, which is a response to the protests of people like Martin Luther King after the Civil Rights Movement, who said it's not just about race, it's also about class. And so Johnson introduced the Great Society, the American welfare state expanded. That all carried on until the economic crises of the 1970s. And at that point, for various reasons, including if you look at the United States, you had the exhaustion, right, of the American economy for various reasons, one of which was the Vietnam War. The second thing was, after 30 years of reconstruction, on the scene now throughout the world were rival economies. Okay, so Korea, Taiwan, Germany, okay, these were all rebuilt, okay, in the most modern fashion, all right, and they could go head to head with American capital, and they did. Okay, on top of that, we had the oil crisis of 1973 and then 1979. Taken together, right, these brought about this period of stagflation in the American economy, higher inflation, higher unemployment than we'd had in a long time. And the reaction to that, okay, was a war launched against the labor movement by the capitalists, right? Because the capitalists felt like what had been regarded as a kind of labor management agreement after the Second World War had gone too far, and labor was getting too much of the pie. And in order to regain, okay, a larger share of the surplus produced by American labor, the capitalists went on a pretty extensive and long-lasting crusade against labor. One of the great moments in this crusade was when Ronald Reagan, right, who was anti-union, when he crushed the air traffic controller's strike of 1981 by firing everybody in the union. So this is a very long history, but the point here is that those 30 years were years in which income from wages for the first time outstripped, let me rephrase that. The growth of income from wages outstripped the growth of income from capital. From capital, for investments, okay? For 30 years, okay? It was a historically unique moment. The Reagan years, and remember, Reagan, Thatcher, right? That whole gang, they came in the 1980s, they reversed that, right? Now we're back, since that time, in the historical norm, where income from capital grows faster, much faster, than income from wages. And American wages have been largely flat, right, since the early 1970s, right? So think about what has happened in your lives, our lives, really, okay? I like to think of myself as much younger, but I'm not, okay? So think about what we've experienced in our lives. In the 1970s, 60s and 70s, as the economy began, as the growth began to ebb, right, women came into the economy in very large numbers, right? And this was to make up, right, for what were flat wages, right, for male workers. You want to maintain your standard of living, you need another worker, okay? Bring the women in, okay? And then we all know what happened there. After a certain point, after 20 or 30 years of women flooding into the market, into the labor market, wages still flat, right? In order to maintain that family buying power, then you used your house, right, as an ATM, right, to put your kids through college, right? Because our generation, as we matured, didn't want to give the same privileges, right, that we had, right? We didn't want to pay the taxes. I'm not talking about you, of course, but we didn't want to pay the taxes that were required to do things like make very inexpensive, high-quality university education available, right, to millions of people. We didn't want to pay those taxes anymore. Okay, so we denied to that generation what we got. Right? What I'm saying here is that for 30 years, we've had a declining standards of living for working people in this country. Longer than that, sorry. That's okay. Should I continue now? Okay, so for 50 years, we've had essentially flat wages in this country. Meanwhile, right, the productivity in the country has not gone down. So if wages are flat, so in other words, if the amount of the surplus that workers are getting is flat, right, and productivity goes up, meaning you're producing more and more wealth all the time, then who's getting that surplus? Okay, we know who's getting it. Okay, so we've had this divide getting ever deeper, right, and lack of opportunity, right, becoming more and more the norm. So I have children, right, who work full time and earn, between 20 and 25 bucks an hour, right? Well, that's really not enough money to live like a full-blown adult in this society. I think, when you're 30 years old, in our generation, you started to think about buying houses and, being able to make car payments, have a house, all of that at the same time when you're working full-time. Many people in this generation can't do that. The minimum wage, I want you to think about this. The buying power of the minimum wage peaked in 1969, right? And if the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage, which is still $7.25, had the same buying power that it had in 1969, it would be something like 30 bucks an hour now. Okay, so this is a reflection, right, of the decline of the position of workers in our society. So what do these policies lead to? They lead to tremendous feelings of frustration, right, by large swathes of the population, and it's worse in some regions than in others. And this has created, in my view, a very, very great anger, okay, alienation. What is the system bringing them? Where are our opportunities? Okay, and you have then the radicalization of certain political views. This is not simply a problem of the United States. Let's go to Northern Europe. I'm very familiar with conditions in Germany. And what we have seen in Germany are a very similar pattern of development. So Germany is a rich country, right? They still provide things that the United States don't any longer. So university education in Germany is free, for example, right? 90% of all German workers are in some kind of state supervised medical system, right? In other words, they have universal welfare benefits, right, that put some of ours in the shade. That's good. On the other hand, East Germany, which you might remember reunified with West Germany in 1990, East Germany has been left behind. It's sort of like a Northern European version of Southern Italy. It is much poorer than the West. It's like Southern Italy is much poorer than Northern Italy. Okay, and many of the young people in East Germany have left. Right, so you have an enormous number of people leaving. Who remains behind? Older people, right? And maybe, very young people who are not old enough yet to leave. And you have unemployment rates that are still much higher than in the West. And you have, over time, the collapse of services that people once took for granted. So if you lived in a small town, this is, I think, not unusual. We see it in the United States also, right? Think about Ohio, for example. But if you live in a small town that used to have one factory, and everybody worked in the factory, and then after unification came, the factory goes under. Now, you're still living there, but there's nowhere for people to work, right? And make the living that they once expected to. So you have to either decide you're going to stay there and maybe live on some kind of dole, or you're going to leave, or you're going to try to become an entrepreneur, right? And a lot of people try that. They go into small business, and how do you run a small business if the people who live there don't have any money to spend in your business? So you have a gradual decline, and then the bus stops running, okay, or the train line stops running, okay, and all of a sudden you find yourself living in this rural backwater with no medical care services nearby. Okay, with nothing to do, nowhere to work, right? This creates an enormous amount of resentment. And it's not a surprise that in East Germany for a really long time, the old communists used to do pretty well in the elections, okay? And over time, those old communists, right, became socialists, right? And they occasionally won power. And then when they had power, they did what people in power often do in parliamentary states. They compromised with the other side, okay? And they weren't able to carry out their program, right, as people had expected. And pretty soon, those people who elected those people to solve their problems give up. And they cast about for some other answer. Right? And then who appears, right, but a group like the Alternative for Germany, okay, the AfD, which is a neo-fascist party that struck roots in the East initially, okay, winning 5–10% of the vote in local state elections, and now is routinely winning 30 to 40% of the vote in Eastern Germany, and 20% of the vote in some of the most populous states in Western Germany. They have surpassed the Social Democrats, the Socialists, right, in terms of their importance in the political spectrum. Right? This is a nightmare scenario because no one wants to form a coalition government with these neo-fascists, and yet the parliamentary rules would call for that. Right? When you win in a parliamentary system, the party that wins the most votes in the election is offered the prime ministership. Okay? Its leader is offered the prime ministership. So what do you do when the AfD in a national election wins the largest chunk of the vote, say 35 or 40%? But everybody else says we can't work with those people because they're fascists. Then you have paralysis. Okay, sound familiar? Okay, so in a way, right, we're coming full circle. right? And we're coming full circle for a lot of the same reasons that we saw in the 30s. There's another element. A person was up here, I was talking to a woman from Germany a few minutes ago who brought up the issue of migration. Okay. This situation that I just described in Germany was exacerbated, right, when the German government of Angela Merkel, right, decided in 2016 to admit 1 million Syrians, right, after the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, and millions of people were migrating from the Middle East. Remember, there had been a revolution in Tunisia, there was a revolution in Egypt, there was a revolution in Syria. You had the ongoing disaster, right, that is Palestine. All of these things came together, and lots of people were trying to get out of that region because it was deadly, and there was no opportunity, and the economies were collapsing, and on, and get to Europe. Okay, I would try it. I think about that, right? Why would you want to stay in a place in which everything is falling apart and you could be killed at any moment, right? Meanwhile, you also have lots of people in South Saharan Africa, right, who are also in tough and really living in terrible conditions, okay? And those people too want to live a better life, and they too are willing to take rafts from North Africa to get to Europe. So you had, in the early decades of this century, you had this ongoing problem, right? It didn't start in 2016, but in 2016 it reached its peak because of the catastrophe in Syria. And Angela Merkel, I don't share Angela Merkel's politics, but Angela Merkel did what was morally the right thing, okay? So Angela Merkel was an East German, remember, right? So she remembers what it's like to live in a tyranny, right? So now she's the prime minister of a free and united Germany, which after the Second World War had spent 60 years reckoning with its past, right? And anyone in our generation who used to go back to Germany, right, and sit on a bench on the street and watch people walking by who were of a certain age, and you would always ask yourself, what was that person doing in 1937? You know what I mean? My wife used to go to the Volkshochschule in a little town that we lived in to learn German. And the Volkshochschule was a converted Gestapo office. Okay, and they put a sign there on the front door saying that in this building, okay, sat the local Gestapo, just to remind you. And so I would sit there waiting for her to come out of her class, you know, and I would be thinking, as you watch these nice German middle-class people going by of a certain age, I wonder what that guy was doing. Well, this is what Germans have been thinking about, especially the younger generations, since 1945. And now the moment came when 1 million people were coming from Syria by foot, coming up, right, from Greece, through Serbia, toward Austria, toward Hungary and Austria. And how did the Eastern Europeans respond? Shamefully. Okay, the Hungarians decided to put up a fence. The Poles took no one from Syria. They took, in the Ukrainian war, they took Ukrainians, because Ukrainians and Poles are ethnically related, they're white, they're blonde, blah, blah. Much easier to bring them together. Okay, but they took no Middle Easterners, no one from the South Sahara. Okay, and so Angela Merkel did the right thing. I mean, the morally right thing. And she said, we'll manage it. We're rich, we'll do it. Okay, so they admitted 1 million Syrians into a country of 80 million people, okay, and they tried to take care of them. And it caused a tremendous upheaval in the society, okay, that exacerbated all the problems that I just described. If you're living in East Germany, and for 25 years, very few of the promises that were made in 1990 have been fulfilled, and now all of a sudden, there's a new group that's going to get enhanced welfare benefits, they're going to live with a rent subsidy, they're going to get to go to school for free, and on and on. You feel like they're getting over on you. Okay? And good God, they all run around, right, in these outfits that are off-putting for many Westerners. Okay? And they have some of them have cultural mores that are at odds with European cultural mores. I'll give you a minor example, and this has been a problem in Germany since the Second World War, because large numbers of Turks, especially from eastern Anatolia, the most backward part of Turkey, migrated to Germany to work. Okay, they ran into all the same problems that minorities run into in many developed countries, including the United States. They are often used, right, in the workplace and then basically cast into kind of ghetto-like conditions, right? And in those communities, they live among themselves. They speak Turkish among themselves. They live like Turks live. But they're supposed to go to German schools, right, where the children sit together. The boys and the girls sit together, where every year you go on a Klassenfahrt, a little class trip together, overnight. Do you allow your girls to go? Of course not. You see what I'm saying? That's a relatively minor thing. But now Angela Merkel invites 1 million of these people from Syria into an already fraught situation, right? And this has resulted in the rocketing in popularity of a neo-fascist political party that says those people are not Germans. Germany for the Germans, right? Which is basically what J.D. Vance says, right? So it's an international problem, okay? When I visited Germany in the late teens, I went to a place called Erfstadt. I lived there for 2 years when I was doing research in Cologne and Bonn. It's a small town village of about, the village I lived in had about 13,000 people. And I made friends with a Christian Democratic family there that I've been friends with for 35 years. And when these immigrants showed up, they were housed, I was amazed really. They were brought in, they were put in a makeshift settlement that was put up overnight, really quickly, okay? Very spare, very simple quarters, right? And the whole town chipped in, right? People, brought clothing. They organized classes to teach the children German, right? They pulled themselves together in an admirable way, and these were people on the right, in the right of center politically, okay? And they were Catholic, right? And they behaved as one would hope a country that had learned from the Second World War would behave. The problem is, not everybody responded that way, right? While you had a town mobilized to help the newcomers, like I just described, at the same time you have people who say, we don't want these people here, okay? And we want them out. And it's the government's job, right, to remove them, right? So, this is, I think we all know, right, Donald Trump's, I can't help it, Trump card was immigration, right? And he used the same weapons, right? Think about J.D. Vance, holy Catholic that he is, lying through his teeth about people eating dogs, about Haitians eating dogs in Ohio towns. Lying, openly, okay? Basically preying or playing on people's most crass prejudices. Okay, so it's an American phenomenon, it's a German phenomenon, it's a European phenomenon, right? The Orban regime also lived from this. Viktor Orban was able to stay in power in Hungary for 16 years, living from this, right? Now, fortunately, he was defeated, and that's maybe worth talking about for a minute because he rigged the game. He learned from Mussolini. He rigged he gerrymandered the Hungarian voting districts so that rural voters had 3 times the voting power of urban voters. This is just one of the things that he did. Okay. In other words, he created a kind of American Senate type system, right? You all know what I'm talking about. If you live in Montana, you have 500,000 people represented by 2 senators. If you live in California, you have 40 million people represented by 2 senators. Who is overrepresented? Or underrepresented, right? So Orban understood this, and he understood that the way to frighten the hell out of rural people is to use the cultural weapon, okay? Cultural wedge issues, just like Donald Trump did, right, in his campaigns. And this scored over and over again, and he never won more than 35 or 40% of the vote, but the whole constitutional order was rigged, right, because he was able to use his majority to change the Constitution and create a situation in which if you win 30 or 40% of the vote, you get 60% of the seats, right? So he was able to hold on to power for 16 years through that kind of activity. And he was defeated by one of his former associates who understood what he had done, okay? And he was able to go to the rural areas and convince people, right, that Orban was a crook, right? That was decisive. He was an immoral crook. And that's how Magyar, the guy who was just elected last week, defeated Orban. Right? That's an oversimplification, but that's one of the key things that happened. Right? So we have to think about how we are not operating in a bubble here. We are part of a much larger phenomenon, right, at this moment in our history. And maybe like 1945, we have to think about, right, if the Republic hangs on, we have to think about how we can once again create a politics, right, that undercuts polarization, right, and that in fact brings about, right, a much more egalitarian community where people have a shared experience and shared opportunity. Going on and on, I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Good morning, Professor. This is Eric, and your answer to the last question largely answered the ideas that I had, but the basic point that I wanted to make very simply is I know that one of the factors that led to the rise of fascism in Germany were the crippling reparations imposed on the German community by the Treaty of Versailles.
Yeah.
And in the same vein, in this country, for all the factors you've mentioned, I think that the Trump and the MAGA movement have been able to play into the dissatisfaction by the loss of jobs, everything that's gone on.
Yeah.
And the fact that such a small percentage of our country controls such a large proportion of the wealth.
Yeah, right. Well, I can only agree with what you just said. The only thing I disagree with is your view of the reparations. Okay, so it is true. It is true that the Allies demanded heavy reparations from the Germans. And it is true that the Germans responded furiously to those reparations and regarded them as a great humiliation. But what the scholarship has revealed in the last 30 years or so is that the reparations were actually quite manageable for the German economy. The German economy had the resources, it could have managed the reparations. The reparations were actually, by historical standards, not much worse, say, than the French had imposed, than the Germans had imposed on the French after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. So the point is that, yes, they were asked to pay reparations, but the reparations themselves were not that draconian. What the problem was the perception of those reparations, okay? And that's what drove the politics. Perception drove the politics, not the reality. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lisa. I'm looking for a loophole to your comparison between. Okay, so your comparison of Trump to Mussolini and Hitler, and I think that for one thing, it seems like Trump is more impulsive and more bold. And you said it took Mussolini 4 years just to get the power. And another way that I think that we could find a loophole is you said that the state of in the dual state model that the normative works and it's working here until it doesn't work. So do you think that that time will come soon?
Well, for some people, it's here. Okay, so I have a neighbor. So my block, I live on 21st Street here, southeast. On the block that I live on now, there are at least 3, maybe 4 Latino households. Right, so there's a guy from Mexico who lives right next to me, whose English is not very good. He married a gringa, right? Who works for the state. And then there's another couple down the street where, that fellow from Mexico seems to go about his life without any hesitations. Okay, he goes to work, he comes home, he doesn't seem fearful at all. Confidence seems to reign. Yet a few doors down, there's a couple where the woman is of Latino extraction, but she is an American-born. Okay, and she herself, right, has expressed hesitation to go out, right, because she's afraid that she could be picked off. Once people start to think that way, then the system is here. If you have people who are afraid to go on the street for any reason whatsoever, and they're fully documented, okay, then something has changed in that society, right? So I have no lack of, I don't fear anything. I'm an old white guy, right? I know where my birth certificate is, I guess, somewhere in the basement, right? Okay. But there are a lot of people in the country who are full citizens who've been here a long time, multi-generational, and they're now afraid to go outside because they could be picked off depending on how they look or if they have an accent or something like that. So for those people, this system is here. The arbitrary system has arrived. And now remember, you can be picked off, you can be brought in, and it could take, I don't know, 2, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, right, before you get out. While you are being processed, you could be sent to some other state. Now, I'm assuming that most of everyone here is retired, okay? But I know that if I was working and I got scooped up by the police and taken off someplace else for 2 to 3 weeks, well, what about my job? Okay? What about my family? Right? And what about the poor slobs who got picked off early in the Trump administration and sent to El Salvador? Now, you all remember those scenes, okay? People arrested on the street, forced to wear these orange jumpsuits. So now, my expectation is that if I get arrested, right, somebody's going to listen to me when I ask for a lawyer, okay? They're going to treat me with some respect, I hope. But I would be fairly confident that I would be treated in a humane way because of who I am, right? But these guys were stripped of their dignity, their heads are shorn, they are forced to wear orange jumpsuits, they are put in chains, and then their heads are bent as they are essentially dragged to the transportation, bus or plane or wherever they're going. And that's before they've been charged with anything. Right? So, the system's here. It's just that for people in this room, we're still living in the state of law, okay? We're in the normative state. We're not living in the prerogative state.
Hi, I'm Virginia.
Hi.
In 2005, I sat in Berlin, about 100 yards from where the demarcation line was, with 3 old white guys. I was a Rotarian there on a Rotarian activity. And the 3 old white guys said, how did we let this happen? How did we get to the point where World War II happened. Do you see any hope that at any point in the future, the old white guys that are sitting in the United States Senate or Congress or wherever will ever say, how did we let this happen?
I ask myself that question every day. You know, my wife is an optimist, you know. So I come home, you know, I spend my days teaching about Nazis and Holocaust, you know. It's not uplifting. And I come home and she'll say something like, we're watching the news, and she'll say something, this goes back a ways, like, maybe John Thune will stand up to Trump on this one. And I say, no, he won't. And then she says, well, you're always depressed about it, blah, blah. But then he doesn't. Okay, and I would argue that he doesn't, because the entire party has been transformed into the vassals, right, of this person. So they have lost their independence. They have lost their sense of dignity. They're willing to accept any indignity in order to hold on to their offices. There I see very little hope, right, that these old white guys in the Senate are going to do much. I feel a little bit better about some of the people in the opposition, not all of them, right? Much more, I think somebody like, I mean, I don't want to do politicking here, but I think somebody like Merkley has been very vocal about the crimes of their regime. He calls them crimes, right? But the test will be, if the opposition comes in, okay, who is going to hold those naval officers responsible who bombed, or the politicians who told them to do it, who have killed hundreds of people at sea, violated every international law, okay, because allegedly, they're running drugs. They have killed hundreds of them without arresting them, without proving that they were drug running. They just killed them. That is not how you operate a state of law, a constitutional order, right? So will the opposition, will the Democrats, if they come into power, will Jeff Merkley and Wyden, right, hold those people accountable? That, to me, is going to be a very great test.
Hi, my name is Franca. Yeah. This is the last question? Okay. So my question is actually about Native Americans. Yeah. So I have heard anecdotal information about Native Americans being stopped and being interrogated about their citizenship. So do you have any information about that?
I don't, really. I specifically on that one, I don't. But it doesn't surprise me, or it wouldn't surprise me to learn that they were being picked up. Because if you're arresting people on the basis of whether they have a tan or not, okay, then why not? Okay, then they become easy targets.
My name is Mark, and I'm going to violate our protocols and answer one of your questions.
Go for it.
And then give an announcement. But you had asked, what do we do in these times? What does everybody do, and what's the action? And I'll say, join the League of Women Voters. And then I just have an announcement, and that is that the Great Decisions group will be meeting in Gowdy Hall for lunch today. So please join us. We can address solutions.
Thank you, Mark. Well, thank you so much for addressing us so timely and so motivating.
It was very fun. Thank you all.
Thank you.